The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
Since the pandemic began, have you come to think better or worse of your fellow citizens? Tonight, two views from the optimistic side of the street. First, a feature interview with author Rutger Bregman on why history really shows humanity in a better light than perhaps our best known and often most inhumane leaders would suggest. Then we'll find out how past pandemics also show why and how societies pull together when facing a threat such as COVID-19. It's Tuesday, June the 16th, and that's all next on The Agenda. Philosopher Thomas Hobbes famously described the natural state of humankind as, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. More than 350 years later, author Rutger Bregman's new book couldn't disagree more. It's called Humankind, A Hopeful History, and it paints quite a different, he might even say revolutionary view of what people are really about. He's a writer for The Correspondent, and Rutger Bregman joins us now from Houten, a small town close to Utrecht in the Netherlands, and it's great to have you with us. How are you managing these days?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. It's a pleasure. Let's start with an excerpt from your book. Here we go. This is a book about a radical idea, an idea that's long been known to make rulers nervous, an idea denied by religions and ideologies, ignored by news media and erased from the annals of history. At the same time, it's an idea legitimized by virtually every branch of science, one that's corroborated by evolution and confirmed by everyday life. If only we have the courage to take it more seriously, it's an idea that might just start a revolution, turn society on its head. Because once you grasp what it really means, it's nothing less than a mind-bending drug that ensures you'll never look at the world the same again. Okay, there's the setup. What's the radical idea?
The idea is that deep down, most people are pretty decent. That's it.
Nobody wants to believe that. Why have you found that people are so resistant to that notion?
Well, there's a very old idea in Western culture that scientists call veneer theory, which says that our civilization is supposedly only a thin layer, a thin veneer. And that when something happens, like a crisis, a natural disaster, or a pandemic like we're in right now, that we revert to our true selves, that we become these savages, and that we really show that we're deep down all quite selfish. And the idea goes back all the way to the ancient Greeks. You find it with the Christian church fathers, the notion that we're all sinners. You find it with the Enlightenment philosophers, with the founding fathers of the United States. It's embedded, I think, at the heart of our current capitalist system, the notion that people are just selfish and that we have to deal with it. But in the last 15 to 20 years, there's really been this silent revolution in science. And so many scientists from so many different disciplines, anthropologists, archaeologists, sociologists, psychologists, they've all been moving to a much more hopeful view of who we are as a species.
And yet, having said that, there's still plenty of skepticism out there for this idea, as evidenced by the fact, well, why don't you tell the story? When you pitched this idea to publishers, what kind of reaction did you get?
Well, it was a hard pitch, right? Because the response that people have is, yeah, but what about this? What about that? What about wars? What about the Holocaust? What about Lord of the Flies? I read that in school. What about the Stanford prison experiment in which, just normal, healthy students turned into monsters? What about what we see in the news every day, right? There's so much evil in this world. How do you account for that? So, I knew that it had to become a long, big book.
Today's publishers are not the only people who had a problem or who might have had a problem with what you said. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to read a few quotes here from people going back hundreds of years. St. Augustine, for example, said, "No one is free from sin, not even an infant." John Calvin, the Protestant reformer, said, "Our nature is not only destitute and empty of good, but so fertile and fruitful of every evil that it cannot be idle." Machiavelli, "For this can be said of men in general, they are ungrateful, fickle hypocrites." John Adams, who succeeded George Washington as the second president of the United States, said all men would be tyrants if they could. The father of psychotherapy, Sigmund Freud, said, "We are descended from an endless series of generations of murderers." You are spitting into the wind of a gale force nature that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah, and
Why don't you
it's
wave the white flag
interesting.
and give up?
It's interesting that all these quotes are from men, right?
Hmm.
I think that throughout history, a cynical view of human nature has been used to legitimize hierarchy and power differences. Because if people cannot trust each other, then we need kings and generals and monarchs and queens, you name it, right? We need all that hierarchy to keep us, the average people, in check. Um, and that's why it's such a revolutionary idea, or such a subversive idea, that most people are pretty decent, because it means, if that would be true, that we could move to a very different kind of society, much more egalitarian society, much more genuinely democratic society. And I think that's the reason why throughout history, these men and people in power have often been wary of this idea.
Do I infer from that comment that if there were more women as the political decision makers in our societies, and of course filling up the higher offices of our companies and corporations, that society might have a different view of this?
Yes, and I think it's what has happened in science. So actually, many of the scientists who have now done more robust, thorough research that show that, for example, after natural disasters, people don't start looting and plundering on a massive scale, but you actually get an explosion of altruism and cooperation. Now, why do we know that? You could read a wonderful book by an author like Rebecca Solnit, Paradise Built in Hell. This is what I found again and again, is that many of these, new findings come from female scientists, which is, to me, that's interesting. Maybe this diversity that is now that we see more in academia helps us to get a more realistic view of human nature.
Eric Lawson was on our program not too long ago, and of course he's got this great new book out on Winston Churchill's first year as Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he paints a very similar picture that you do in his book of, despite the Luftwaffe blitzkrieging Great Britain to the tune of, I think, 40,000 dead over the course of a couple of months, and this is how your book opens. You talk about this same time in history. The anticipated reaction of the British people to essentially fold their tents, turn on one another or on their leaders, and become completely demoralized never happens. Go ahead, tell the story. What did happen?
Yeah. Well, on the eve of the Second World War, all these military experts, and including politicians like Churchill, they were very afraid that, people would just go nuts once the bombs would start falling on London. But then it did start, and pretty much the opposite happened. It was like a spirit of calm that dawned over London and other cities in the UK. Again, a huge amount of cooperation and solidarity and altruism. And then, obviously, the question was how to explain this. And elites explained it by sort of referring to the brilliant British culture. They said, oh, this must be our stiff upper lip, our keep calm and carry on mentality. Then in 1942, they had to decide what they would do with their, bombers. Would they bomb strategic targets in Germany, like factories and roads, or would they bomb the cities? Now, what the experts said is, look, we obviously responded with our very characteristic British spirit. We work together. But the Germans, they have a very weak moral character. We can just start bombing them and we'll easily break their spirit. So in the end, Germany was bombed 10 times as heavily as Britain. And it didn't work again. So it was after the war that a team of British economists studied what the effect of the bombing had been. And they found that actually the cities who had, been hit the hardest saw increased production, actually were more resilient compared to the cities that were not bombed as heavy. So it's the same mistake that those at the top make again and again. It's a little bit like they look in the mirror and they assume that, average people are as selfish as they are. But that's not the case, because power does corrupt. But, most people are pretty decent. You could argue that they made the mistake again, actually, on the eve of the Corona crisis. And, as all of this was starting in the UK, many experts in Britain were afraid that, the British public couldn't handle it, that they would become tired easily, and, this problem of fatigue. And it's what was one of the reasons why Britain was slow to go into lockdown, and why now they have a higher rate of infections and deaths. It's elites underestimating the resilience of ordinary people again and again and again.
Rutger, I have a feeling a lot of people watching this either read the book, The Lord of the Flies, when they were younger, or they saw the movie, and you referenced it already in one of your earlier answers, this story about all of these kids who end up on this deserted island, And I mean, the conventional wisdom is they turn on each other and destroy each other. But you have found a real life example in Oceania, I guess, is it Oceania? I guess in the South Pacific, an island near Tonga, where this really happened, and you find a different conclusion. Go ahead, tell that story.
Yeah, I just wondered whether it had ever happened, whether there's ever been a real live Lord of the Flies case. Because I read the book when I was 16 or 17 years old. I remember feeling quite repressed afterwards. But it was only years later that I wondered, maybe there's a real life example that I could find. So after a couple of months of research, I managed to find a real case. This happened on the island of Ata, which is a little bit to the south of Tonga, which is an island group in the Pacific Ocean. And there were 6 boys from an Anglican boarding school who were just, they were fed up with school. They didn't like school meals. So they decided to borrow a boat and, just go on an adventure. Now, already on the first night, they ended up in a storm and, they drifted for 8 days, then shipwrecked on this island and somehow managed to survive for 50 months. After a lot of research, I found the captain who rescued them. His name is Peter Warner. He's an Australian captain. And he put me in contact with one of the real Lord of the Flies boys, even though he's now more than 70 years old. His name is Mano. And together they told me what had really happened. And almost in every single way, the real Lord of the Flies is the opposite of the fictional Lord of the Flies. The real Lord of the Flies is a story of friendship, of hope, and of cooperation.
You also talk about not a placebo effect, but a nocebo effect. Nocebo. What's that?
Yeah. Well, it's important when we talk about human nature to remember that our view of who we are as a species can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what we believe can become true, just like with the placebo effect, right? If you believe that some kind of medicine or an injection or a pill, you name it, is going to cure you, then, it might actually help. But you also have the opposite of that, which is a nocebo. If you think that something is going to make you sick, then you just might see that happening. And I think that it's a little bit the same with our theories of human nature. They can become self-fulfilling prophecies. And the problem is that for decades, maybe even for centuries, we've designed so many of our institutions around the idea that people are just selfish. Our schools, our workplaces, our democracies, our criminal justice system, our prisons, you name it. And I think we could turn it around. I think we could design our institutions in a very different way and say, oh, wait a minute, maybe we can assume the best in kids in school or our employees on the workplace and, make trusting them the central dogma instead of saying that people are just fundamentally selfish.
If we did that, how would the end of the story be different?
Well, I think it would have pretty huge implications. The first half of the book is about this sort of silent revolution in science, right? So many scientists moving to a more hopeful view of human nature. The second half of the book is about applying the theory and just seeing what could happen. Now, let me give one of the most radical examples here, which is the prison system that they have in Norway. Now, the Norwegian prisons are very strange because they assume the best in inmates and in criminals. These criminals get the freedom to socialize with the guards, who often don't even wear uniforms. They get the freedom to, work together, play together, make music together. They've got their own music studio. They've got their own music label, which is called Criminal Records. It seems very counterintuitive. But then you look at the evidence, and it turns out that actually Norway has the lowest recidivism rate in the world, the lowest chance that someone will commit another crime once he or she gets out of prison. So these prisons that don't really look like prisons, where, it's all about actually trusting even people who've done pretty horrible things, right? These are not nice guys, done, murderers or rapists. But then still, to design your institution in such a way gets you much better results. While the opposite, the traditional prison is often a university for crime, right? You take citizens and you turn them into criminals. But what they have in Norway is they take criminals and they turn them into citizens. So that's just one of the examples of what you can do once you update your view of human nature.
If you take that approach, though, you do not satisfy some members of the public's bloodlust, I guess I could call it that, for revenge or treating harshly those who have done bad things, right?
Yeah. I'm not saying it's easy. It's easy to assume the best in those who are close to you, right? In your friends, in your family members, in your co-workers. That's easy. And we've also evolved to work together and to cooperate on a face-to-face basis. We human beings were one of the only species in the whole animal kingdom that have the ability to blush, which I thought was fascinating to discover, right? Is that we involuntarily give away our feelings to someone else, and that helps us to establish trust. But that becomes much more difficult if we can't see each other anymore, if we're in the trenches of social media, or if it's about those other people far away, those immigrants, those criminals, those terrorists. And then it takes a lot of courage and, all of your rationality to still cling to this belief that in the end, we're all humans, and we all have this basic decency that we need to rely on.
Let's talk survival of the fittest. Is the most important story to settle on here the evolutionary one, as in just what exactly it was that our fittest ancestors had to do to survive? You want to help us with that?
Sure. For a long time, I believed in a quite dark or cynical theory of evolution. The question is obviously, why did we survive? Why have we conquered the globe? What makes human beings so special? Why not the Neanderthals, or why not the chimpanzees? Why us? Why do we build pyramids and spaceships and you name it? And for a long time, people believed that it must have something to do with our intelligence, that we're supposedly so smart. But turns out, if you do an intelligence test and you let a human toddler compete with a pig or a chimpanzee, then often the pig or the chimpanzee wins. We're not that smart, actually, individually. Then the question is, are we very strong? No, that's not the case either. I mean, you do a boxing match with a chimpanzee, and well, I don't recommend it. But then the question is, what is our superpower? What is the secret of our success? And what scientists now argue is that it's actually our friendliness. It's our ability to work together. And they literally talk about survival of the friendliest these days, which means that for millennia, it was actually the friendliest among us who had the most kids, and so had the biggest chance of passing on their genes to the next generation. And you can really see this in our bodies. We sort of have a more friendly appearance today than we had 50,000 years ago. Sort of the scientific term for this is that we've self-domesticated. Just like wolves became chihuahuas, right? We have become what I call homo puppy. We've puppyified. And that is really the true secret of our success.
Well, you mentioned Neanderthals in the midst of that answer, so let me do a follow-up on that. There was a time when Homo sapiens lived alongside our close cousins, the Neanderthals, and many people, including Yuval Noah Harari, have said that we likely slaughtered them all, that we committed mass genocide. Do you think that's what happened?
No, there's absolutely no archaeological evidence for that. It's just pure speculation. And I think we have a much more likely explanation, which is that in an ice age, it's tough times. How do you survive? Well, you don't start collecting possessions, but you need to collect friends, because that's what you can rely on in such times. And I think that what made the difference for us as a species is that we're just better at that. We evolved to be friendly. And there are sort of clues still in our bodies that we can look at here. I already talked about our unique ability to blush. We can also look at our eyes. So humans are the only of all the primate species, and there are 200 primate species in total, that have so-called cooperative eyes, which means that we have white around our irises, right? So you can follow my gaze, and we can all follow each other's gazes. And that's different with all the other primates, with chimpanzees and orangutans, because they've got dark around their eyes, which means it's much harder to follow their gazes. They're a little bit like poker players wearing shades. And that's obviously not very helpful if you want to learn how to trust each other. So we've been shaped by millennia of evolution to work together and to trust each other. And I think that's what made the difference in the end.
Let me ask you about Richard Dawkins, the well-known biologist and very famous atheist, I guess I can call him. 2 years after he published Selfish Gene in 1976, where he argued we are born selfish, there was a little-known Russian geneticist named Dmitry, I'm probably going to get his name wrong here, Belyaev or something like that, published his research about breeding foxes. Tell us about the significance of this.
This is one of the most fascinating experiments that has been done in the 20th century, and few people know about it. It was a huge surprise for me as well. So what happened in the 50s is that Dmitry Belyaev had this idea to turn a fox into a dog. And he worked with silver foxes, sorry. And they had never been domesticated ever. You know, domestication is this process where you basically select for friendliness. And so he started doing this. And it happened actually quite quickly. He was able to, sort of select the friendliest of the silver foxes and then turn a quite aggressive species into a very puppyish species. And what he discovered is that there was a whole list of traits that arose there. This is what scientists call domestication syndrome, and you see it with other domesticated species as well, pigs and dogs and cows and you name it. They have these traits like smaller brains, thinner bones, and in general, they just look a bit more childish, or pedomorphic is the scientific term. And then you look at these traits and turns out, you know, we as human beings, compared to our ancestors 40, 50,000 years ago, we've also been domesticated. But we did it ourselves, right? We've self-domesticated. Now, how did this help us? There's one evolutionary anthropologist called Brian Hare who did intelligence tests with both the wild foxes and the domesticated foxes that Belyaev had breeded. Turns out that the domesticated foxes were actually smarter than the wild foxes. So he has this very interesting observation that if you want a smart fox, you don't select for smartness or for intelligence, but you select for friendliness. And again, the theory is that this is exactly what has happened in our own evolutionary history.
We may have a deep capacity for kindness and cooperation within our tribe, but we are also capable, as we have seen throughout history, of dehumanizing horror for those that we deem to be outside our tribe. As individuals, we may not be terrible, but at a group level, does this pessimistic view of nature still hold?
Yeah, and this is obviously the big question that hangs over my book. How can you ever argue that people have evolved to be friendly while at the same time we're clearly also the cruelest species in the whole animal kingdom? You know, wars, ethnic cleansing, genocide. We're capable of such cruel things that no other animal, right? I've never heard of a penguin that says, let's exterminate a whole group of other penguins. You know, these are singularly human crimes. I mean, libraries full of books can be written about this question. A beginning of an answer would be, I think, to look at this self-domestication theory again, because then you'll discover that there's actually a dark side to friendliness. So many of the biggest atrocities in our history have been committed by us in the name of friendliness and in the name of comradeship and of loyalty, because we don't want to let our friends down or don't want to let our group down. And then you get this in-group, out-group behavior. I think that empathy and xenophobia and indeed friendliness and sometimes our more horrible behavior are two sides of the same coin. So yeah, sometimes this friendliness is exactly the problem. And I mean, you see this in the history of progress as well, right? I mean, so often progress starts with people who are willing to be unfriendly and who are willing to go against the status quo.
I wonder, though, how this argument plays. You're not that far away from Germany, certainly a lot closer than we are. How does this argument play in Germany where, let's state it, there were righteous Gentiles during World War II who did put their lives on the line to save Jews. There were thousands of those kinds of people, but there were far more people who were prepared to turn the other way and ignore the fact that some of their fellow citizens were being put in ovens and their ashes were raining down on them while they ignored it all happening in their midst. How is that consistent with the point you're trying to make?
Well, the standard explanation here would be something like, there's a Nazi in each and every one of us. And we all heard of these very famous social psychology experiments that happened just after the Second World War, the Milgram experiment, in which people were willing to give dangerous electric shocks to completely innocent other people just because an authority figure had told them to do so. And we've heard of the Stanford prison experiment, in which, you know, healthy pacifist students very quickly turn into savage monsters only because, you know, they have been given a uniform and some power to do whatever they want. So usually people come with that explanation, which is, I think, another version of this Veneer theory, you know, that deep down we're just savages and the Nazis just below the surface. What I think is that really trivializes atrocities like the Holocaust. If we want to understand something like that, and I mean, you have to write and read libraries full of books about it. But what you actually start looking at is a very complicated historical process where there are different layers of explanation. So if we talk about the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, for example, why did they keep on fighting in 1944, 1945? Why was this the most effective fighting force in the whole of the 20th century. Well, what the Allied psychologists thought at first was that they must have been brainwashed, that they must have been this very fanatical Nazis. But then they started interviewing prisoners of war, and they discovered that many of these soldiers were actually fighting not because, they were so obsessed with this Nazi ideology, but because they didn't want to let their friends down, that the power of comradeship was just nowhere as strong as in the German army. Now, this explanation may work there, but it obviously doesn't work for, the SS elite. And then you need to look at different kind of explanations. For example, the corruption of power, or indeed the process that you mentioned of dehumanization, is that over time we can start looking at other people and not see people, but see things or animals or creatures that are of inferior quality. And it's a really dark truth about our species that we're capable of this. So I didn't want to write some kind of happy clappy book about the power of kindness and let's change the world. It's, I think, a paradoxical book as well. But I do disagree with this notion that there's just a Nazi below the surface in each and every one of us, because I think that actually trivializes the dark chapters of our history.
Let's finish up on this then. What does this more hopeful view of human nature portend for our ability to address, let's say, outside of a pandemic, the biggest issue facing us on the planet today, climate change?
Well, I've got one chapter in the book about climate change, and I use the story of Easter Island to talk about it. People, probably all know of these huge statues that were built on Easter Island, the so-called Moai. And the standard story of Easter Island is that here you have this civilization that became obsessed with building these huge monoliths, but then had to cut down all the trees, to actually produce them and to get them in place. Then all the trees were gone, the soil eroded, people didn't have food anymore, civil war broke out, they became cannibals. And so when the first European explorers arrived on the scene, they found a civilization that had basically committed eco-suicide. And Easter Island, this story is often used to say, look, we're doing the same thing to our planet right now. And, human beings, we're a bit like a virus. We're just so selfish that we just destroy everything in our way. And I think that, again, these stories can become self-fulfilling prophecies. Cynicism is often another word for laziness, because what's the point of activism if it's just hopeless anyway? And so I decided to take another look at the story of Easter Island. And it turns out that actually the recent consensus of anthropologists and archaeologists is very different. They actually discovered that even after the trees were gone, not because they had all been cut down by people, but actually because of a plague of rats, they innovated and they came up with new agricultural techniques, and actually food production went up. And when the first European explorers arrived, the first one was a Dutch guy actually named Jacob Roggeveen. He found a place that he described as an earthly paradise. So that doesn't mean that, we don't have to worry about climate change. It's clearly the greatest threat facing the world today. But we too often underestimate our own resilience, and problems can grow exponentially, but solutions as well. And if we just look at what's happened in the past 5 years, there's so much more awareness around it right now. And there's a whole new generation coming that, really wants to do the best possible thing we can. So you don't have to be an optimist, but I think we can have hope, because hope is all about the possibility of change, and it impels you to act.
You have given us a lot to think about, particularly those who are very adamant in what they believe and think you're wrong. But they should give this argument a chance. It's called Humankind, A Hopeful History, and it's brought Rutger Bregman to our program tonight from the Netherlands. Thank you so much. Great to have you on TVO tonight.
Thank you.
Tomorrow on the agenda.
If an officer is involved in the killing of a civilian, you would like to think that they would go and give a statement pretty rapidly and they would be interrogated. Often these agreements include clauses that will require the officer to agree to the time and location when that statement could occur, delaying it. It might guarantee a right to huddle with other officers on the scene to talk about what happened, and it might even dictate what can happen in that room. It might, for example, require breaks every 20 minutes. It might limit the type of questioning that can occur. So it fundamentally shifts accountability within the system in a way that is much more beyond what you would normally see in the collective bargaining process.
That's tomorrow on the agenda. You've heard it over and over during this pandemic. We're all in it together. Mind you, there's also been some hoarding and, of course, some selfish and careless activity, too. Either way, to some extent, we're all putting our trust in one another to keep us all safe. Here to reflect on the history and psychology of social trust at times such as these, we're joined in Paris, France by Laura Spinney, science journalist and author of Pale Rider, The Spanish Flu of 1918 and How It Changed the World. And in Vancouver, British Columbia, Stephen Taylor, professor of psychiatry at the University of British Columbia and author of The Psychology of Pandemics, preparing for the next global outbreak of infectious disease. And it's great to welcome both of you to our airwaves tonight here in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Laura, I want to start with you by asking, how would you characterize what a pandemic brings out in most people?
I think from my historical research of what happened in 1918 and also from having lived through this actual pandemic, that I'd have to say it brings out the best and the worst in people. You saw that then, you saw people sticking together, helping people, even though it wasn't necessarily very rational in a situation of contagion. The same thing today. And you also saw the stockpiling, the xenophobia, the profiteering, as you mentioned.
Stephen, when there is a global pandemic, the likes of which we saw a century ago and now again today, what sort of pressure does that put on the level of social trust we have for one another?
It puts enormous pressure on, because in order to manage a pandemic, as you know, we all have to agree to do things the health authorities suggest that we do. We have to agree to engage in social distancing. We have to agree to wash our hands and follow basic hygiene and so forth. And if people don't trust the health authorities, they're not going to follow what is being recommended. So social trust is vitally important.
Laura, in your book on the Spanish flu, you wrote, quote, "Your best chance of survival was to be utterly selfish and jealously guard your hoard of food and water and ignore all pleas for help." Did much of that happen?
No. And that's what's fascinating. I mean, that would have been the logical approach. That would have been the way to ensure your own survival, and actually everybody else's as well. Because if everybody did that, there would be no transmission of the disease. There would be no contagion. But in fact, people reached out to each other. They helped each other. There's a story from South Africa of the mother of a family taking the baby of her white neighbors because the parents were both ill and couldn't breastfeed it, and she breastfed it until the white mother was able to. So there was a reaching across color lines there that didn't usually exist. You see amazing acts of kindness in the thick of the pandemic, even though it wasn't necessarily the logical thing to do.
And they did it despite knowing that it could cost them their own health, eh?
They did. I mean, I think there's a sense that of what some psychologists have called collective resilience, that we might come out of this better if we all stick together. And maybe there's some truth to that. There's perhaps more truth to that in a different kind of natural disaster, say an earthquake or a fire or something. But when contagion is involved, the rules change slightly, and yet people still stick together, at least in the thick of it. That tends to break up either side, but we can talk about that maybe.
Stephen, that term, collective resilience, do you see it coming out now during this global pandemic?
We do, and you see that in all natural disasters as well. That trauma, when it happens to a community, people do pull together to help one another. And in a sense, it gives people a sense of control, that they're actually doing something to feel like they have some kind of agency over whatever challenge they're facing.
I guess I want to figure out, Stephen, how much of this happens on a kind of a broader macro societal level, and how much does it come down to our particular individual temperaments? Have you been able to figure that out?
It's a mix. Humans are fundamentally tribalistic. So we come together and help out one another in our community, but you also see the rise of racism and xenophobia. But we do find individual differences. Some people overreact to the threat. They become highly anxious and withdrawn, whereas other people underplay the severity of the pandemic, thinking the whole thing is overblown. And they're the people who don't wash their hands or don't engage in social distancing. So you see a whole gamut of responses.
Laura, I wonder if I could just go through a few quick examples with you from your book. And I'm going to guess that 99.99% of the people watching this right now were not alive when any of this stuff happened. So we're going to go down memory lane here for most of us. 1919, Rio de Janeiro. What happened?
Well, Rio de Janeiro was really, really badly hit in the lethal second wave of the pandemic, which was the previous autumn, 1918. What happened in 1919 is really interesting, though, because it was Carnival, as every year, in February. And the flu hadn't gone from the city. It was still there. People were still falling sick and dying, though it was the tail end of the epidemic and it was leaving. But you can imagine there was a very strange atmosphere in the city. The theme of that year's carnival was divine punishment, and more people attended it than ever before. And it's really strange. You're reading the historical records, you have to read between the lines, but it looks like it kind of degenerated a little bit. It was this huge party, perhaps an orgy. The rules broke down slightly. And I don't know, maybe a sense of we're still alive. Things got out of hand and it became this huge party, orgy. I don't know. Something similar is supposed to have happened after the Black Death, by the way, in Italy in the 14th century. Maybe it's life reimposing itself over death, but it was a strange time indeed.
Stephen, do we want to say the more things change, the more they stay the same? I mean, look at Brazil 100 years later, and they're kind of, I mean, their governments, their people are almost acting like nothing's going on, like there's no reason to change anybody's behavior right now.
Exactly. All the things we're seeing in this pandemic, we've seen before in previous pandemics. The big difference is this is the first pandemic in the age of social media and digital interconnectivity. So everything is happening bigger and faster, but the same fundamental phenomena that we saw during the Black Plague or 1918 pandemic, we're seeing here, including fatigue with social distancing. We're seeing that right now. People are getting sick of being in lockdown, particularly the younger people, and they're craving to get out to attend demonstrations or carnivals or social gatherings. And of course, there's the concern there that could precipitate a second wave. And I guess also it's a part of it, wishful thinking too, that we saw in previous pandemics, wishing the whole thing would be over and you could get back to socializing with your friends and life as it was before.
I've never thought that wishing away was a particularly good medically proven way of doing anything.
It's not, but it's very commonly used. Wishful thinking is a very common coping strategy for people.
I mean, in 1918, for example, a lot of people turned to prayer. Even some, even very scientific people, people were desperate. They'll do anything that might possibly work to bring normality back.
Stephen, as we look back through the history of pandemics, how much racist scapegoating happens, blaming one particular group for the disease, for example?
It's sad to say, but a lot of racism. When people feel threatened with infection, you tend to see a rise of racism. It's a way of, if you think of it as an evolved mechanism of protecting oneself, because historically, the lethal diseases came from foreigners. If you think about the European explorers to the Americas, they brought influenza and smallpox and so forth, which decimated the locals. So it's an evolved mechanism. That doesn't make racism right. Racism is not right, of course, but it does happen. During the Black Death, there was racism against people of Jewish ancestry. During SARS, racism against Asians. This time around, racism against Asian people. It's always happened, and particularly the people who have pre-existing racist attitudes and the people who are very frightened of infection. The people who are very frightened tend to react with xenophobia.
We would like to think 100 years later we're a little more enlightened at this time, but are you still seeing plenty of evidence that, for example, because this coronavirus started in China, that Asians in general and Chinese people in particular are facing the same kind of stress now?
It's the same thing over again. It's sad to say, but the racism is the same, and in part, it's part of it is due to community leaders too. Community leaders who refer to the coronavirus as the Chinese virus. That's going to incite racism. We're seeing racism second time around as well.
Although it's interesting, Stephen, if there's one group that we sort of know is more likely than not to contract COVID-19 by virtue of the kind of work that they do, it's healthcare workers. And yet they have become hardly scapegoated and certainly not avoided. They've been celebrated, people banging their pots and pans at 7 o'clock every night and cheering them as they come off shift. I know that happens in Vancouver where you are as well. How do you explain that?
Well, it's complicated. back during the SARS epidemic, there was massive discrimination against healthcare workers. This time around, what we're seeing is complex. You know, it's one thing to get out on your balcony and cheer healthcare workers. That's cheering at a distance. You're in the safety of your apartment. It's a very different matter altogether to get into an elevator crammed with doctors or nurses. So we are seeing avoidance and discrimination of healthcare workers. At the same time, we're also seeing cheering and support. But these people they're protected. They're separated from healthcare workers. So it's a bit of both.
Right. Laura, let me impose upon you to go back to South Africa, where you gave us that anecdote a few moments ago. And as opposed to one anecdote, can you talk to us about whether or not there was and remember, this is in the thick of apartheid, can you tell us whether there was a more general peacemaking between white and black populations in South Africa related to the pandemic of 100 years ago?
Well, I think South Africa is a really interesting example because it illustrates this idea of collective resilience really well. Because the idea of collective resilience is that it only really holds when there's this external threat to everybody and everybody feels like they're in the same boat. So in the middle of what was called Black October in South Africa, the worst second wave, you saw this reaching out across color lines. You saw this coming together and this kind of heartwarming, I suppose we would think of it, behavior. But then when the pandemic started receding, then that resilience started to break down too. And in fact, the black community and the white community started mutually accusing each other of having brought this disease in. And it's from the early 1920s, once the pandemic has receded, that you see the first enactment, in fact, of the laws of apartheid, the first segregation of cities. That had been talked about before, but it was only after the pandemic that passed into legislation.
I see. Okay. So the worst of apartheid was, in terms of a legal system, was still to come. I see.
Yeah.
Stephen, there may be a greater, excuse me, there may be a greater sense of togetherness nowadays, but again, based on history and based on what you know of human nature today, does that kind of thing last?
That's a big question. We all wish this altruism that we're seeing is coming together. We would hope that it would last, but I think things will go back to normal once this pandemic passes. The psychological reactions to pandemic are dynamic. They fluctuate and change over time. And initially we saw the selfishness of hoarding behavior and so forth, and the coming together of altruism. And as the pandemic recedes, sad to say, we probably will see a reduction in altruism as people get back to their self-focused, busy lives.
Well, Laura, let me get you to weigh in on that from this angle. You know, there are a lot of people in this society today that that other people are taking a second look at in a different way. And by that, I mean personal service workers, first responders, the people who stock groceries on our shelves, truck drivers who get stuff along highways of this country and into those grocery stores. Again, based on history, once the pandemic is over, are we going to go back to sort of marginalizing and thinking less of these people who we're now calling heroes?
It's a really good question. History teaches us, unfortunately, that we do tend to forget as soon as the pandemic's passed. But I think we sort of learn, we just learn a little bit each time and we get a little bit better. So, for example, now in many countries, there are official pandemic preparedness committees. And assuming they still continue to exist, I would be very surprised if they didn't take on board the notion that if we don't look after those key workers, then everything falls apart. So hopefully those concepts and you know, ideas about protecting those workers, supporting those workers, giving them all the equipment they need will get built into a pandemic preparedness plans in a way that they haven't perhaps sufficiently this time around. And by the way, just to go back to the point about xenophobia, the Spanish flu is the iconic example because it did not start in Spain, but the Spanish were accused because their press was uncensored, unlike the warring nations, and so they described the first cases in Spain, whereas other nations kept those quiet. So the name of that, the worst pandemic in modern history, is a sort of monument, unfortunately, to the xenophobia that comes with pandemics.
What should we have called it if not the Spanish flu?
We don't know where it started. And in fact, it's a very bad idea really to label anybody and to point the finger at anybody. Unfortunately, you need a name for the thing at the beginning so that you can talk about it. But at the beginning, you don't really understand it very well. So it's exactly then when you shouldn't be naming it at the same time in a way. It's good that we managed to keep it rather bland this time. That's a good thing.
in some ways, we keep doing that, right? I mean, there is something called MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. We have, well, needless to say, there's a certain president who kept calling this the Wuhan virus or the China virus. We don't seem to be getting any better at not labeling these things or not focusing them on a certain country. Isn't that fair to say?
I think it's a really fine line, because there can be useful information in a name. If it came from a certain region, maybe it tells you about the intermediate host or something to do with that region. But you want to be able to convey information that's useful about it without stigmatizing anybody, especially when you don't know the actual cause or the path it took to humans. So it's a very difficult problem. And I even the WHO, which issued guidelines in 2015 about how to name diseases, or rather how not to name them, how to avoid stigmatizing people and places, hasn't quite cracked it. It's a very difficult problem.
Stephen, I want to ask you about masks, because masks have in some respect become, you know, the big indication about whether or not you're a person of altruism or empathy, because of course the mask is not meant just to protect you, it's meant to protect others from you having droplets hit them. So what are you seeing out there right now in terms of how accurately mask use reflects our empathy for one another?
It's a complex issue, and part of the problem is our health authorities have been inconsistent on the wearing of masks. Initially, we were told we shouldn't wear them, there was no need, and now we're suddenly being told everyone should wear masks, and the research hasn't changed. There's no solid research that shows that masks are beneficial, but it logically makes sense to adopt a better safe than sorry approach. So there's that component to it. There's also the cultural component. Mask wearing is traditionally a cultural practice for Asian peoples, and so when you've got this rise of xenophobia, mask wearing gets associated with Asian people and can trigger xenophobia. And then to make things worse, when a person wears a mask, it's hard to read their expression. It's hard to understand what they're saying. So there's that sense of psychological distancing. And of course, mask wearing can be uncomfortable for some people. So for many reasons, people are reluctant to wear masks. And some people react with rebellion. They see being required to wear a mask as an infringement on their freedoms, and so they might reject mask wearing for those reasons. And on the other hand, you've got people who are very anxious about their health and are wearing masks even when they're alone at home. So you get all kinds of motivations and effects of masks.
Well, of course, for some in the disabled community, it becomes particularly problematic, because if you're deaf and you're trying to read lips in order to understand what's going on in your world, and if everybody's all masked up, you're going to have a hard time understanding. But Laura, I wonder whether or not this debate took place in 1918, around the time of the Spanish flu.
It absolutely did, and it took on almost the exact same dimensions. Mask wearing wasn't compulsory almost anywhere. It was the only place it was compulsory, I think, was in California, not even in most of the US states. And people were relatively compliant to begin with, I think, but then basically the scientists started arguing about it. Did they work? Were they effective? Weren't they? And then over time, people's compliance started to fall off because people were falling ill anyway. They saw that it didn't work. And as Stephen said, people's patience wears thin with public health measures over time anyway, because they're just getting more frustrated with the restrictions on their lives. And then you saw the whole civil liberties thing come in. So there was anti-mask leagues, and it became a question of personal freedom. And then you saw leaders who forgot themselves in public, maybe a mayor's mask who fell for, was just dangling from his ear. And then people took that lead, and everything started falling apart.
Stephen, let's talk about what happens to our trust for institutions, and in particular government, during a time of pandemic. What does it do? What do pandemics do to the level of trust people have for those things?
Well, people look to government for guidance. How serious is the threat? What should I do about it? And if the government is seen as being transparent and reliable, as being providing timely information and acknowledging uncertainties, people are going to trust the government and follow their recommendations. But if, on the other hand, if government is inconsistent, you're going to get a lack of trust, and so people are less likely to follow government recommendations.
Laura, here's a quote from a book by a guy named John M. Barry. The book is called The Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history. And he writes, "The final lesson of 1918, a simple one, yet one most difficult to execute, is that those in authority must retain the public's trust. The way to do that is to distort nothing, to put the best face on nothing, to try to manipulate no one. Lincoln said that first and best, a leader must make whatever horror exists concrete. Only then will people be able to break it apart. In your judgment, has that happened in the year 2020?
Actually, I don't think Abe Lincoln was the first to say that. I think John Locke said that in his discussions of the social contract. But it's absolutely correct. It was true in 1918. It's true today. That trust between the government and all the authorities and the people is absolutely crucial, and it's a delicate thing. It can die or wane or wax, all the time, and you have to nurture it. And of course, we're seeing it today. If people don't have trust in their authorities to be leading them well, then they won't comply with the measures. And the measures should not be mandatory. It's much better if people comply voluntarily. But for that, they have to be A, informed, and B, properly engaged. So information and trust are absolutely crucial. John Barry is completely right.
Could I get you to weigh in, Laura, on which leader, political or medical or whatever, in the world today has been the best at practicing that advice, and who's been the worst?
I'm not sure that's a fair question. So if you're asking me who has given the clearest messaging, who has been most engaged with people, I can think of several examples. There's a health minister in Kerala, Shailaja Teacher, who did a great job. There's some of the female leaders who've been very clear and very calm all the way through. And then there are some governments who've given some confused messaging. And I don't necessarily think it's all their fault, because the scientists are changing their minds all the time too. But transparency isn't necessarily about always giving the same message. It's about saying, I'm following the advice, you're hearing it from me first, I'm keeping you updated, you're hearing what I'm hearing as soon as I hear it. Full disclosure. And we're all in it together again.
I notice you didn't want to name names on the second part of that question. She smiles and we move along. Oh, okay,
Mr. Macron was very good.
Okay. She says in France right now. Okay, good enough. Stephen, how about you? Same question. As you look around the world, who's done great? Who's done lousy?
I don't think any leader has done a perfect job. I don't think that's possible. But I think Justin Trudeau has done a fairly good job. Early on, he's sending out the message that he's listening to the people, he's acknowledging socioeconomic concerns, because that has been one of the big impacts of the coronavirus, the effects on people's livelihoods. So he's been doing that, leading by example generally, self-isolating, wearing a mask, but not being afraid to pull punches. Early on, you might remember when people were violating social distancing, he sent out the message, and that message was go home and stay home. Emphasizing the importance of social isolation. So by and large, I think he did a great job. In comparison, south of the border, I don't think President Trump has done a very good job at all. He's pushing to open up the economy prematurely, circulating conspiracy theories, prematurely tweeting about hydroxychloroquine as a treatment, or the bleach conspiracy theory as a treatment, which has had all kinds of unforeseen consequences. So, and he's not alone. Some other leaders haven't done particularly good either, going out to the pub, shaking hands with people, underplaying the whole thing, and then getting COVID yourself. And you know who I'm talking about there.
That might be Boris Johnson, the UK PM. You might be referring to there.
And also the Brazilian leader as well.
Yes, Bolsonaro has not been covered in glory either. Stephen, have countries with higher levels of social trust actually had better outcomes during this pandemic?
That's really hard to say, because there are so many factors at play. So I really couldn't say at this point.
Okay. Laura, let me point you back to your book, where you point out that Indigenous elders in Alaska advised survivors of the Spanish flu to, and I'm going to use the word here, I hope I've got this word right, Nalanguarluku. That is the Indigenous word from Alaska. And the gist of it is, pretend this never happened, as in that's the best way to cope with this. Have I got that right?
I was talking then about the UPIC of Bristol Bay, who were, 40% death rate. So they were completely traumatized by that pandemic, which decimated their communities. And I thought that was really interesting. The advice of the elders to the young people afterwards, and also after previous epidemics that they were exposed to, was to pretend it didn't happen. That's what that word means. And so, that, first of all, obviously that speaks to the suffering, the way they thought it was best to move on after that disaster. There was just no speaking about it. There was only rebuilding and looking to the future. But I think it also speaks to the issue of memory, and why our memory of that disaster is so patchy and so poor, really, compared to some of the other disasters of the 20th century. It is that those people who were worst affected, either willingly or unwillingly, were deprived of a voice.
Stephen, in our last 30 seconds, can I get you to weigh in on whether you think by the time we get closer to the end of this thing, forgetting it will be a big part of our coping strategy going forward?
It's called emotion-focused coping. So it is a coping strategy people use when they can't actually practically solve the problem. I don't think that's going to work this time around, because chances are that COVID-19 is here to stay. And if not COVID-19, then there will be another pandemic by some other infectious agent in the coming years or decades. So I don't think we're going to forget this as easily as we forgot, say, SARS or Zika or some of the previous pandemics.
Well, I'm certainly not going to forget this conversation. You two were fascinating, and we learned a lot. So thanks to Laura Spinney and Stephen Taylor for your time on TVO tonight. All good wishes to both of you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, June the 16th, 2020. There are a lot of people talking about defunding the police right now. Tomorrow, we'll look into that issue, including the role unions play in the conversation. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.